Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to wait until a few more people enter the room and then we'll make a start. So a very warm welcome. Please do settle down where you are. Likelihood you'll be at home. Hope you have a cup of tea in front of you. And we're going to have a lovely few hours together. So I'm just going to wait for a few more people to get here. I can see you entering the room at the moment. And a warm welcome to everyone. So thanks to those joining us now. I'll just wait a minute or so and then we'll make a start. Fantastic. Thanks for those just joining us. Big welcome. I'm just watching the little number of people entering the room go up, and then we'll make a start and introduce everyone and start the presentation. So thanks so much for joining us. As I was saying earlier, I hope you have a cup of tea in front of you and you're all settled at home. You're in a nice quiet space. I can't promise the same for all of us. You might hear doorbells or animals walk across the screen, but it's all part of being at home. So good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll make a start if that's okay. So it's just a couple of minutes past 2 o'clock. A warm welcome to everyone joining us on this online webinar, Miss Clara in Depth. My name is Flora Kay, Learning and Engagement Manager at the Barber Institute of Fine Arts. We're all here, although not physically in our galleries today, to explore themes and discussion around the Barber Institute of Fine Arts current exhibition, Miss Clara and the Celebrity Beast, 1500 to 1860. And for those of you who might not have visited us before, the Barber is a fine art gallery and concert hall situated on the University of Birmingham campus, and we are open. So please do, not straight after this webinar because we might be closed, but at some point please do book in and come and see our wonderful collection. And displaying there is not just our Autumn in Focus exhibition, Miss Clara and the Celebrity Beast, but also alongside our impressive permanent collection of paintings, works on paper, sculpture, coins and other art objects. And I'm joined today by 3 speakers. So I'm very happy to be joined by curator of this exhibition and the Barber's Head of Collections and Deputy Director, Robert Wenley, Professor Helen Cowie and Dr Samuel Shaw, as they present their contributions to the supporting exhibition catalogue as well. So I thank you for being here today, everyone. And you should be able to see our speakers here, and they'll give more of an introduction themselves when they're showing their papers. Also today, unfortunately, Dr Charles Avery won't be joining us, but we do wish him well and thank him for his contribution to the catalogue and the support of this exhibition and the realisation of the exhibition as well. So thank you, Charles. So just a small bit of housekeeping before we start. So the event today, as you might have experienced before or might not have, it is in webinar format. So that means we can't see you today, but we can kind of communicate through the chat and in other ways. So we're going to be running this webinar till around 4 o'clock. We expect a short comfort break, probably just before 3. And also, depending on questions and conversations from yourself and our audience participants, we expect to run to time as well. So we'll see how it goes. And speaking of which, I encourage you to use the chat today for any general comments, and please do add specific questions directed at our panel, especially if it's to someone in particular, through the Q&A function. So you might see this either on the bottom or the top of your screen. There's the chat, which is the little speech bubble, and then Q&A, which is kind of 2 speech bubbles. So specific questions in the Q&A, please, and then just general chat and comments. I really encourage you to keep that going throughout our papers this afternoon. Closed captions are automated today through Zoom. So similarly, it should be along that panel there entitled CC if you require closed captions. And we will be recording today's webinar. And I'm going to do my very best to monitor the chat throughout as well. Just a kind of slight heads up here. In today's presentations, they will likely feature images of animals and artist representations of animals, either in distress or captivity, and there'll be images of taxidermy as well throughout the exhibition. So I'd like to hand over now to our first speaker. I think that's enough of housekeeping. So Robert Wenley, thank you so much for joining us today. While you're getting your slides up, I just encourage everyone who's with us just to say a big hello in the chat and maybe say where you're from, where you're kind of zooming in from today. That would be fantastic. So Robert, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Flora, for that introduction. It's great to be here today talking to everyone about Miss Clara and the Celebrity Beast in art. I'd like to add my warm welcome to everyone attending today, and particularly to my fellow speakers, Sam and Helen, and also to Flora for coordinating this afternoon. I'm going to begin just before I give my main presentation, just to introduce very briefly the exhibition itself for those of you who've yet to visit. The exhibition considers the life and very extensive travels of a young female Indian rhinoceros brought to Holland in 1741 by an enterprising Dutch sea captain called Davy Mout van der Meer. And this arrival caused an international sensation, as she was the first rhino to be seen on continental Europe since the late 16th century. Mout had the vision to tour her extensively for nearly 20 years until her death in London in 1758 around Europe. In particular, she visited Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, as is plotted on the map you can see, I think, in this image here in our intro section to the exhibition. And this is a view of the exhibition space itself, quite small but densely packed. The main part of the show looks at sculptural representations of Clara, centering on the Barber's own bronze, which is the central image here. The impetus for the show and the focus of my talk today, as well as other two-dimensional depictions of her, through which we can also trace her travels. In addition, the exhibition considers other celebrity beasts or megafauna brought to Europe, such as elephants, hippos, as well as rhinos, which captured the imaginations of artists and public alike between about 1600 and 1880. We'll hear more about some of these, of course, from Sam and Helen. So now to my talk. As mentioned, at the core of the Barber exhibition are 4 sculptural representations, 2 of marble and 2 bronze, near identical in their modelling of Miss Clara, the greatest celebrity beast of the 18th century. This short paper will explore and explain the fascinating respective ownership histories of these 4 sculptures in more detail than was possible in the exhibition, and look at how they are all related. I'll start, in fact, with various ceramic versions of the same model, essentially, which were made at the Frankenthal porcelain manufactory around 1770. None of which, unfortunately, we were able to borrow for the show. And one of these is shown here on this right-hand image. In size, they are closely comparable to the 2 bronzes, of which the Barber's is shown on the left. The ceramic versions are about 38 centimeters nose to tail. The bronze is a little larger at about 46 centimeters. But you can see how close the modeling is of the 2. Frankenthal, just outside Mannheim in central Germany, was one of the great German porcelain manufacturers, operating under a privilege from the local ruler, Elector Karl Theodor, who bought the factory in 1762. Karl Theodor van der Pfalz became Elector Palatine in Mannheim in 1742. He later inherited the Bavarian dukedom and lands of the Wittelsbachs in 1777 and moved his court to Munich the following year. He was a major patron of the sciences and arts, in particular architecture, sculpture, and above all music. Under him, the Mannheim Orchestra became one of the most famous and progressive in Europe, attracting no less a figure than Mozart, from whom Karl Theodor commissioned the celebrated opera Idomeneo in 1780. A Frankenthal porcelain price list of 1777 mentions an undecorated rhinoceros alone, and another as an Urgehaus or clock case. These can be associated with documented and surviving pieces, a plain white rhinoceros photographed here in 1911, but not seen since, and 2 examples of the rhinoceros clock. One of the rhino clocks, shown here on the left, was kept by the Elector himself in his bedchamber at the palace in Mannheim. This example, as you can see, has retained the clock case, unlike the other on the lower right, now in the Schloss Museum at Mannheim. The African masks on the saddle cloths of the decorated versions, incongruous and, as we said, even offensive to our eyes, should be understood as a decorative motif suggestive of the East, a rather amorphous concept at this date, of the lands beyond Europe, from where the model for this beast, the rhino Clara, of course, originated. This is a contemporary image of the Schloss or palace at Mannheim, with the elector's apartments in a corner pavilion right at the back on the far right of this very extensive complex. And here in this modern drone view, the elector's bedchamber is pointed out on the right there. And as you can see, the Schloss at Mannheim is one of the very largest Baroque palaces in Europe. Excuse me, this plan shows the position of the elector's bedchamber, top right, at the climax of the enfilade of Baroque state rooms, to which only the most high-ranking officials or guests would be admitted. So the objects in the bedchamber were of great personal significance. That a rhino clock should be found there presumably reflects the fact that the animal itself had some residual meaning to the elector. We know that he saw Miss Clara in person at the Peacock Inn in Mannheim when she visited Mannheim in November 1747. And so we may presume that the impression this left encouraged him to commission sculptural renditions of her in ceramic form, albeit apparently some 15 or 20 years after the visit. So who modelled these ceramic sculptures? The Mannheim court sculptor, Peter Anton von Verschaffelt, would be the obvious candidate. And there is good evidence to suggest that this was indeed the case. Verschaffelt was born in Ghent, now Belgium, in 1710, and trained first with family members who were sculptors before studying in Paris under the celebrated sculptors Verbeck and Bouchardon. Having completed his apprenticeship with a first prize medal, he moved to Rome, where he worked from 1738 to 51. It was there in June 1750 that he certainly could and very probably would have seen Clara in the flesh during her long years of touring and made sketches and perhaps models of her. While in Rome also, Verschaffelt fulfilled various commissions for the Pope, including replacing the colossal bronze statue of the Archangel Michael for the Castel Sant'Angelo, which you see on the right. Between 1751 and 52, he was briefly in London at the invitation of Frederick, Prince of Wales, before being appointed court sculptor to the Elector Karl Theodor in Mannheim, where he lived and worked for the rest of his life. In 1756, Verschaffelt founded at Mannheim one of the first art academies in Europe, which he also directed. Though largely forgotten today, despite all these achievements, at least outside Germany, his work was once highly regarded, including, for example, by Goethe, and he was raised to the peerage by both Karl Theodor and the Pope. Besides some portraiture, Verschaffelt produced sculptural altarpieces, architectural designs and ornament, and garden statuary for various palaces and official buildings in and around Mannheim. This included much animal sculpture, for which Verschaffelt was especially regarded. He made around half the 86 sculptures in lead, marble or sandstone commissioned for the gardens at the elector's summer residence at Schwetzingen, including the water-spouting deer shown here on the right. So that's the replicas on the right and the originals now under a roof on the left. He also made several lions and other hunt-related animals, as well as classical and river gods, naiads, obelisks, and vases, all clearly inspired by the gardens of Versailles. So this brings us to the sculptures in the actual exhibition. Crucially, the Frankenthal porcelain rhinos, which we can link both to the Elector and to Clara, can also be associated with a large-scale marble rhinoceros by Verschaffelt, or at least we think it's by Verschaffelt. Just such a sculpture was mentioned among works in marble listed as of his hand that remained in his workshop after his death in 1793. These were published in his anonymous and posthumously published brief biography of 1797, specifically, quote, rhinoceros in white marble on a red marble pedestal. From the context of the sculptures listed alongside it, this was probably about 3 or 3.5 Mannheim feet long, which translates to roughly 90 to 105 centimeters. A remarkable marble rhinoceros of this size is now widely accepted as the very one mentioned in Verschaffelt's biography. The resemblance to the Frankenthal rhinos is compelling in all details. as visitors to the Barber exhibition can confirm. The proportions of body, head and legs, the pose of the head and the closed mouth, the shape of the horn, the heavy folds at the neck, the hooves and tail, the marking on the skin, all these are distinctive and directly comparable across all these models. Indeed, the only significant difference to the porcelain versions is the palm trunk set under the beast's belly, a very practical addition without which the weight of the animal's marble body would have been unsustainable. Unfortunately, we know nothing more of the circumstances or date of the creation of the marble version, but we may suggest Verschaffelt's marble was carved around 1765 to 70 and was perhaps originally intended for Schwetzingen or the gardens of another electoral palace. These will accord with the dating of the Frankenthal versions, and we may further surmise that there was a common plaster or clay model sculpted by Verschaffelt. But the unanswerable question arises, why was the marble left in Verschaffelt's studio at his death? The marble rhinoceros is first documented with the banker Baron Anselm von Rothschild in the formal gardens at the Grüneberg, Frankfurt, having been in his collection, it was said, for many years. Frankfurt is just 40 miles from Mannheim, and there is no other surviving or documented marble rhinoceros sculpture of a scale suitable for a formal garden. The Grüneberg, or Green Castle, had been purchased by the childless Amstel Mayer von Rothschild in 1837 from the descendants of another banker, Peter Heinrich von Bethmann-Metzler, who had purchased the estate in 1789. Amstel had bought the property for his nephew, Anselm, and his new wife. They built the chateau seen here in 1844-45. It was destroyed exactly 100 years later, and laid out the French-style park in 1850. Conceivably, the marble rhinoceros was acquired in 1837 from Bethmann-Metzler with the property. Anselm was the founder of the great art collections formed by the Viennese branch of the famous Rothschild banking family, which was continually enhanced by successive generations until the Nazi era. He initially favoured miniatures and small-scale objets de virtu, such as ivory and wood carvings and goldsmiths' work, but was later persuaded by his art advisor, the artist Moritz Daniel Oppenheim, to acquire paintings as more fitting for a great collector. This led him to buy, en bloc, an important collection of Dutch old masters in 1842, including this fine landscape, just the start of his purchases in this area. By the time of his death in 1874, he owned over 100 old master paintings, of which 90 were Dutch or Flemish, as well as nearly 600 precious works of art. The marble was then bequeathed by Anselm to his youngest child, Alistair Rothschild, who brought it to Aythrop near Wadston, Buckinghamshire in 1875, as seen here 100 years later in this photograph, and from where it was moved to its current location on the estate in 1996. Although an association between the Rothschild marble and Frankenthal rhinos had been published as long ago as 1949, its attribution to Verschaffelt was first made and published in our exhibition catalogue. Similarly, although a second small-scale marble version of this specific model has been on public display at the Bowes Museum in County Durham since it opened in 1892, the specific attribution to Augustin Portois was first made and published in our exhibition catalogue. It's just a little bit larger than the ceramic rhinos and notably more refined in its modelling, but again, it clearly derives from the same prototype. Portois was born in Ghent, and after training with Verschaffelt in Mannheim in the 1770s, he returned there to do various projects at St. Barber's Cathedral. You can see some of these listed in his dictionary entry on the right. A marble rhinoceros, described as sculpted from the life, was exhibited by Portois at the Ghent Salon in 1796 and 1802, although its dimensions are not recorded. This clearly must imply that Verschaffelt's model, from which Portois' marble clearly derives, was taken from life studies of Clara, since Portois himself, being born in 1753, would have been too young ever to have seen, let alone studied, Clara directly. The marble rhino was listed as still with him in Ghent in 1820. The Bowes marble, on the other hand, first appears as a, quote, a rhinoceros carved in white marble with a pedestal in black and yellow marble in a list of objects sent from Ghent to Paris in November 1868. This list written by John Bowes, who with his wife, Josephine, co-founded the Bowes Museum at Barnard Castle in 1869. Although John had earlier bought some interesting old master paintings, their collecting in earnest was confined to an astonishing 12-year spree between 1862 and her death in 1874, when they acquired some 15,000 objects, mostly at very cheap prices on the London and especially Paris art markets. These purchases included an astonishingly wide range and rich range of European ceramics, furniture and textiles, as well as literally hundreds of old master and modern Italian, Dutch, and most famously French and Spanish paintings. John Bowes, whose interest in sculpture was more limited, probably bought the marble rhino via his favoured agent, Rogier, who was based in Ghent. And given its earlier provenance there, and in the absence of alternative candidates again, it seems certain that the Bowes marble was the very one exhibited by Pourtois in Ghent and retained by him in 1820. As mentioned, the Ghent Salon references to this version reinforce the likelihood that Pourtois' master, Verschaffelt, modelled the primary Rothschild sculpture. We may surmise that after Verschaffelt's death, Pourtois had access to his models and felt able to pass off the conception as his own. Conceivably, he had a hand in sculpting the large marble while in Verschaffelt's studio, and so felt he had some moral right to reproduce it. The two near-identical patinated bronze versions were evidently cast from the same model. They are very close in dimensions to the Bowes marble. One is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, shown here, and the other, of course, in the Barber Institute, the main focus of the exhibition. They are undoubtedly among the most sophisticated and appealing of the many representations of Miss Clara that this much-loved and gentle beast generated. We cannot be sure whether the V&A and Barber bronzes immediately post-date the closely comparable Pourtois marble and depend directly on it, perhaps being cast in Belgium or France for the local market, or if they predate it, perhaps being cast in Mannheim under Verschaffelt's eyes. The Rococo taste for the colourful and decorative ensured that dark bronzes were much less fashionable across Europe in the mid-18th century than before or after that period, which might argue for a date closer to the Pourtois marble for the rhino bronzes. Moreover, the fine detail of bronzes seems closer to the Bowes marble than to the softer modelling of the porcelain versions. But it is perhaps more likely that the bronzes were derived directly from the same clay or plaster model by Verschaffelt as the ceramic iterations, and were cast, therefore, at much the same time. And while most of Verschaffelt's work was in marble, stone, plaster, or terracotta, he certainly did occasionally produce large-scale works in bronze, most notably the Archangel Michael, as mentioned. Although this cast was by a local metal worker, we do know that older members of Verschaffelt's immediate family cast bronze statuettes in Ghent in the workshop of Jan Baptist van Helderberg, an example of his work shown right. And it seems very likely that Verschaffelt would have learned and used his family's bronze casting knowledge and techniques. Unfortunately, the two bronze rhinos are first securely documented only as late as the 1880s. But while there is no firm provenance or ownership history for either before the late 19th century, in each case, one can reasonably be projected back to the 1820s or 30s. The Barber bronze first appears in the literature in 1908, published by Wilhelm Bode and Murray Marks as Italian 15th century, a little bit out there, when in the collection of the English stockbroker and amateur etcher John Postle Heseltine. Heseltine's interests as a collector were diverse and deep, encompassing Greek and Roman antiquities, Italian maiolica, English porcelain, and Oriental works of art, as well as British and European fine art. His collection of Old Master and modern paintings, which numbered well over 100 examples, was strongest in the Italian Renaissance and Baroque Dutch and 17th century and 18th and 19th century English schools. His collection was best known, however, for its drawings, of which he was regarded as one of the greatest ever collectors in England, and also for his sculpture. His sculpture collection was one of the very finest of its day, strongest on small bronzes of the 15th to 17th century, but also including contemporary commissions and acquisitions and works in other media. Animal bronzes were a particular strength, so his bronze of Miss Clara, if never understood by him to be as such, was in good company. It was in part published visually in 1922, when sold en bloc to the London dealer Alfred Sparrow, from whom the Barber would eventually buy the rhino bronze in 1942. Thanks to the sharp eyes of my colleague Dr Claire Jones, we now also know that the Barber bronze had, rather excitingly, previously belonged to the great Victorian sculptor Sir Edgar Boehm, in whose studio we can just make it out, without its head, in this studio portrait photo of 1883, and in whose sale it appeared in 1897, where, or soon after, Heseltine most likely bought it. Well, there's every reason to think that Edgar Boehm, as one immersed in sculpture, would have purchased this fine bronze himself. It's also possible, intriguingly, that he inherited it from his father, Joseph Daniel Boehm, the imperial court medalist, engraver, and mintmaster in Vienna. Joseph Boehm was probably the greatest collector of the mid-19th century in Vienna. His celebrated and pioneering collection included works on paper by Raphael, Michelangelo, Dürer, Holbein, etc., Old Master and modern paintings, German 15th and 16th century sculpture, and classical antiquities. Well connected and living not so far from Mannheim, Joseph seems quite a strong candidate to have acquired the bronze, perhaps locally. Much of his collection was sold posthumously in a huge sale in Vienna in 1865, but as yet no trace of the rhinoceros. The Milanese cast of this bronze has an equally distinguished ownership history, having been bequeathed to it in 1909 by the Australian-born George Salting, one of the very greatest of its benefactors and of the highest importance as a collector in several fields. The heir to his Danish father's vast fortune, made principally from shipping wool from Australia, Salting began collecting in the mid-1860s and continued doing so until just before his death, when he left his diverse and extraordinarily fine collections to the British nation, really a landmark moment in the cultural life of the country. Nearly 200 paintings were selected by the National Gallery, 450 works on paper by the British Museum, and more than 2,500 varied and exquisite works of art came to the V&A, including some 80, mostly Italian, bronze statuettes and 300 medals and plaquettes. Salting's bronze rhino had been purchased in 1907, only 2 years before his death, at the sale of Major Francis Baring of Norman Court near Salisbury. Francis Baring belonged to one of the great banker collector dynasties, in fact, second only to the Rothschilds, until the notorious collapse of the bank in 1995 at the hands of the rogue trader Nick Leeson. Francis Baring had inherited Norman Court himself and its collections only a few months before he sold them, and the bronze was most likely brought into the family in a previous generation, either by Charles Baring Wall, MP, who's seen on the right in the left-hand image, or by his cousin and heir, Thomas Baring, also an MP and banker, on the right. Charles established a reputation as an authority on artistic matters, with his London townhouse praised by Disraeli, no less, as the most beautiful house I ever entered. Charles certainly collected bronzes, since several of them, mostly by 17th Italian sculptors like Soldani, are listed in a description of Norman Court, published in 1833, the date of this image. Charles's heir, Thomas Baring, was an even greater collector of furniture, porcelain, and particular Old Master paintings. He also especially favoured Dutch 17th century pictures, like Anselm von Rothschild, acquiring several hundred of the highest quality between 1835 and his death in 1873, an example given here. And in one of those quirks of history, Thomas Baring's memorial monument in Micheldever Church, Hampshire, was designed by none other than Edgar Böhm, seen on the right. So the ownership history of each of these four sibling Clara sculptures has now been revealed as particularly rich. All of the collectors involved were of the first rank, but their common interest in this exquisite model reflects their refined aesthetic discrimination, more, I think, than their deep pockets. None of the smaller sculptures certainly would have been particularly expensive once on the secondary market. The name of their creator seems to have been rapidly lost in each case, but is now at last happily restored. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much there. Amazing to see that final image there of the other loans, and especially just thinking about scale, obviously, because I've been into the galleries, I don't think we can quite appreciate the scale of that marble loan in the centre of the gallery there. So I think I will get the time lapse of the installation up in a little bit so we can just see just how that was placed in the gallery. So I just had one comment from Judd. So Judd is from Woodstock in Oxfordshire, and it was, did I hear Robert mention a rhinoceros model being at Haythorpe Park before going to Waddesdon Manor, or did I mishear and was it somewhere else? So I'd just like you to confirm that. But
sure, I think it's pronounced Athrop, maybe Ethrop, but I think it's adjacent or part of the Waddesdon estate. So they're very close physically. So that's Buckinghamshire. Yeah. Thank you.
And any other questions kind of relating to Robert's specific presentation there, do put them through. We will have time at the end for more general Q&A, but just a big thank yous coming through on the chat there, Robert, for that lovely setup and introduction to the Miss Clara exhibition. So we're just going to have our first and only comfort break today, just as part of this webinar. So during that, I think we'll have, let's say, up to 20 to 3 as a comfort break. So please do go make a cup of tea. And while we're doing that, I'm just going to get up a time lapse actually of how we installed that large marble sculpture in our exhibition, so people can have a look and relate that to Robert's exhibition. And then following that, we're going to be hearing from Helen and Samuel as well. So please do go make yourselves a cup of tea. I'll get up that video now, and we'll meet back here at about 22 to carry on. So thanks so much, everyone. Thanks everyone. I'll just give everyone another minute. Sit down, get your cup of tea, and then we'll have the last two speakers of the afternoon. So I hope there that you saw the time lapse of the installation, especially when we were moving the marble into the center of the gallery. And there was a great question here about just asking exactly how much Miss Clara weighed. And Robert answered this, knowing about 250 kilograms. We had to make allowances for it being more like 500 kilograms, but we're only able to weigh it on the day it was moved. And that is especially a really amazing consideration that the Barber team had to take into account when putting the installation of this exhibition together. It's not just about obviously having the exhibition open and audience members coming, but all of that preparation that has to be done beforehand. And if anyone has been to the Barber before, you will know that we do have a lift that can go up and down to the galleries, but we had to consider a lot there when bringing artwork into the building. So amazing to think of what a practical feat it was also to get all of that wonderful artwork into the galleries there. So thank you for that question. I think it really brings to life some of the things that we have to think about as a team. So I'm going to pass over to our second speaker of the day now, Helen, and if it's okay, Helen, I'm going to just introduce you for a second. So Professor Helen Cowie is a professor of early modern history in the Department of History at the University of York, and I believe Helen is saying hi from York today, and a member of the Centre for 18th Century Studies. And she completed her PhD at the University of Warwick, so not far from Birmingham, and joined the department at York in 2011. Her research focuses on the cultural history of science with a particular focus on the history of animals. And a growing area of study, this is the history of animals, explores changing human-animal relations and kind of reveal a lot about the attitudes of different societies. She also researches and teaches the history of Latin America. So a huge welcome, Helen. I'll hand over to you for your next paper, so thank you.
Thank you, Flora. That's fantastic. I'm just going to share my screen, which hopefully everybody can see now. Get that on presentation mode. We're off. Right, brilliant. Thank you, Flora. Yes, so I work on the history of animals, and in particular that's involved looking at the history of zoos, slightly more obscurely the history of llamas, and more recently the history of animal commodities. But today I'm going to be focusing on two animals that feature prominently in the Clara exhibition, Tuni the elephant and Obaish the hippopotamus. These are the bits that I contributed towards the exhibition, and it's great to be involved and great to be here today and talking about this. So in this presentation, what I'd like to do is to say a little bit about the lives of these animals and to give you a bit of a context for how they were represented. But I'd also like to explore the concept of animal celebrity in a bit more depth and to think about why it is that some animals become famous whilst others do not. So what influenced the way in which different species of animals were viewed, presented and valued, and how far have these criteria changed over time? I also want to think a bit about whether this fame was something ephemeral or whether it had a bit of a more enduring quality. So why is it that we remember Tuni and Obaish long after we've forgotten other captive elephants and hippopotami? And I'll offer a few brief suggestions for why this might be at the end of my talk, but I'm also happy to explore this more in the Q&A and to hear your ideas as well. To start with, though, I'd like to focus on the first of my two pachyterms, Tuni the elephant. And I should warn you, this is quite a sad and a tragic story, so apologies for that. Unfortunately, that was the case with many of these animals exhibited in the 18th and 19th century. So who was Tuni? Tuni was an Asian elephant, caught near Bombay when he was around 5 years old. He was shipped to London in July 1810 and purchased for 900 guineas by Henry Harris, manager of the Covent Garden Theatre. And you can see him in this image performing in a pantomime. In 1814, Tuni was bought by the showman Edward Cross, who you can see here cradling a lion cub, and he was transferred to the menagerie at Exeter Change. He soon became one of the prime attractions in the exhibition, picking up buns thrown to him by visitors and ringing a bell every evening to announce the start of feeding time. And you can see here on the right, one of the tokens that would have been used to enter Exeter Change. We can also see here an image of Exeter Change itself. This is actually in the exhibition. And what's most obvious and striking about this is how little room the animals actually had here. So they're all in these very cramped dens with a bit of kind of faux foliage along the top. Tunis at the back there, he could barely turn around in his cage, which partly explains what follows. So for several years, Tuni entertained the public without incident. As he reached maturity, however, he began to exhibit signs of must. And this is a condition that affects all male elephants over the age of about 20, and it recurs annually during the mating season, and it's exacerbated by being in captivity. Cross tried to pacify his elephant, dosing the animal with the latest remedies at the time, which included sulfur, treacle, calomel, Epsom salts, tartar emetic, and croton oil. But despite these precautions, Tuni's condition deteriorated, and with each passing year, the pharmaceutical remedies decreased in effectiveness. In 1825, the elephant fatally injured his keeper, a man called John Chepchen, fracturing his breastbone and ribs with a blow from his tusk. When Tuni once more entered a state of must in February 1826, Cross decided to have him destroyed. So initially, he opted to poison the elephant by mixing arsenic into his food, but Tuni sussed this out and wouldn't eat it. So Cross had to resort to the more dramatic measure of actually shooting the elephant. He requisitioned soldiers from a local militia to do this, but they didn't have big, large-scale elephant guns in these days. So this ended up being a very long and harrowing process. It took about half an hour and 152 bullets to finish Tuni off. So obviously deeply unpleasant. A contemporary diarist, William Hone, described how Tuni flew around the den with the speed of a racehorse, uttering frightful yells and screams. And the Times painted an equally gruesome picture, noting that the quantity of blood that flowed from the elephant flooded the den to a considerable depth. The life, and more specifically the death of Tuni the elephant, made headlines across Britain, and it left an indelible imprint on the public consciousness. In life, Tuni's fame can probably be attributed primarily to two factors, his exoticism and his accessibility. So though elephants would become much more prevalent in Britain in the 19th century as the wild beast trade expanded, they were still quite a rare commodity at the start of the century, and that heightened Tuni's novelty. The fact that this particular elephant was exhibited in Exeter Change, which was based in the Strand in London, meant that he could be quite easily visited by people. He was quite accessible. And this meant that people who were particularly smitten with the elephant could in fact visit him on multiple occasions, as some of them did, forging, in their view anyway, quite a close bond with him. So the actor Charles Mayne Young, for instance, who'd worked with Tuni at the theatre, recollected in his memoirs how he'd often, when passing through the Strand with any friend, drop in on Tuni, pay him a visit in the den, and show the intimate relations that existed between them. And another contemporary, writing in the immediate aftermath of Tuni's death, recounted in mournful verse how he would frequently visit the elephant and offer him food, as he put it, and many an apple to thy den I've bought, and many a nod of thanks received from you. So repeated interactions of this nature engendered a sense of intimacy, which was quite unusual with wild animals, and it conferred on Tuni the status of national or at least metropolitan pet, and indeed personal friend. In death, meanwhile, Tuni's ghoulish demise filled the broadsheets, generating an outpouring of sorrow and grief. So one paper, the Herald, all the while Tuni lay dead, inserted comparative notices of the deaths of all the elephants who distinguished themselves since the time of Noah. And another paper reportedly devoted a whole column, when everybody fancied the business was over, to the smell that the elephant made 4 days after his dissection. These lurid textual descriptions of Tuni's death was supplemented by a range of quite graphic visual representations, which took advantage of recent technological developments in the field of printing. So this print that you can see here by the caricaturist George Cruikshank shows soldiers firing at a rearing elephant while lions, tigers and monkeys watch in horror through the bars of their den. And this is in the Clara exhibition. Chuni's body was subsequently put on display in his former den for several days as a sort of grisly souvenir of his demise. And as you can see, many people visited it. He was then dissected by anatomists to learn more about elephant anatomy and physiology. And all of this was reported at length in contemporary newspapers, sustaining interest in the famous elephant. What's perhaps particularly interesting about Chuni, though, is that his fame endured, and you get lots of mentions of him throughout the 19th century, often in relation to particular places or current events. So, for example, when the American circus proprietor Phineas Taylor Barnum bought his white elephant, Tung Taloon, to visit London in 1884, the paper, the Daily News, ran a feature on what it called distinguished dumb visitors, recollecting all the important animals that had visited Britain before. And among these, the bast elephant Chuni received the most attention. Similarly, when another famous pachyderm, Jumbo, was sold to the same Barnum in 1882, elephant lovers noted parallels between his case and that of Chuni, adducing the latter's fate as evidence of how not to treat an elephant suffering from must, because Jumbo was also believed to be becoming violent. So one writer, under the pseudonym a Lieutenant General, voiced his fear that elephants are no better understood now in England than they were 50 years ago, when poor Chuni was so cruelly murdered. Chuni's name also frequently came up in discussions of the old Exeter Change menagerie and even just the Strand itself, where the menagerie was housed, surfacing in newspaper articles up to the 1890s. That little image you can see on the right there comes from a magazine article in the 1890s, reporting how Chuni still has a niche in the Temple of Fame. And the elephant's physical remains also stayed on view throughout the 19th century, first as a reconstructed skeleton in his former den, and later as a scientific specimen in the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in Lincoln Inn's Fields. And it remained there until it was destroyed by German bombing in World War II. In 1910, a guide to the museum identified what it called the noble Chuni as one of the foremost curiosities in the museum's historical cabinet, where it apparently sat alongside a segment of Napoleon's intestine, the horse Orlando, winner of the Derby in 1844, and the skull of John Thurtle, who was a notorious murderer. So Chuni's celebrity thus equaled and maybe even exceeded that of many of his human stars, from his era, ensuring him a place in the national memory. So that's the rather sad tale of Chuni. I'd like to move on now to think a little bit about my second animal, which is Obaish the hippopotamus. And this is a slightly more happy story, although, as we'll see, not completely. So who was Obaish? Obaish was the first hippopotamus ever exhibited in Britain and the first representative of his species to reach Europe since the Roman Empire. Donated to the Zoological Society of London by the Viceroy of Egypt, Abbas Pasha, he was a star attraction at the zoo, and he remained so until his death in 1878, captivating artists, scientists, and the general public alike. Obaish's illustrious career began in July 1849, when he was caught by hunters on the island of Gebaish on the Nile. He was transported overland to Cairo, where he was cared for by the British consul, C.A. Murray, and he was subsequently transferred to the port of Alexandria, where he boarded the P&O steamer, the Ripon, to Southampton. During the voyage to England, Obaish apparently consumed 80 pints of milk a day, for the furnishing of which several cows had to be kept on board the boat. He also bathed daily in a specially constructed iron tank, holding about 400 gallons of water, which had to be changed each day. And this was to keep his skin from becoming dry. The Zoological Society attributed Obaish's safe passage, to C.A. Murray's watchful care, to the liberality of the director of the Peninsular and Orient Steam Company, to the attention of Captain Moresby and his officers on the Ripon, and to the faithful services of his Arab keeper, Hamid Safi Kanana. And Safi Kanana actually accompanied Obaish throughout his journey to Britain. Apparently, he actually lured Obaish into his cage at the zoo by walking in front of him carrying a bag of dates, which were supposed to be the hippo's favourite food. Following his arrival in London, Obaish was an instant sensation. So thousands of visitors had already congregated at the docks in Southampton, hoping to get a glimpse of this rare pachyderm, and thousands more visited the zoo in the weeks and months after Obaish arrived. And the zoo actually experienced a significant spike in visitors during this period. Artists and scientists also came to see the hippopotamus, subjecting the young creature to careful scrutiny. One of these was Don Juan Carlos Maria Isidro de Bourbon, Count of Montezon, who photographed Obaish in 1852. And you can see the image he produced on the left there, picturing the hippo lying next to his pool. The image on the right is by Frederick York and shows an older Obaish, again standing next to his pool. The chief illustrator at London Zoo, Joseph Wolfe, also painted Obaish, and in this rather fetching image showing him lying on his side with his little pink belly protruding. This is in the exhibition. I think it's probably my favourite image of the exhibition. And the comparative anatomist, Richard Owen, was apparently granted a private audience with Obaish shortly after his arrival. And he then wrote a report describing the animal, focusing on the hippo's barrel-shaped trunk, short, thick legs, and wrinkle hide. And he likened Obaish's peculiar cry to the snort of a horse, ending with an explosive sound like a bark. As well as drawing physical crowds, Obaish also quickly permeated popular culture, and he generated a plethora of hippo-themed paraphernalia, again, some of which is in the exhibition. So the musician Louis Saint-Marc composed a hippopotamus polka in Obaish's honour, and you can see the frontispiece to the polka there, showing a tuxedo-wearing hippo dancing with a woman. Joseph Gorwin produced this small statuette of Obaish, allegedly made from Nile mud. Charles Dickens saluted the hippo in his magazine, Household Words, praising the beast's unctuous appetite for dates, his jog-trot manner of going, and his majestic power of sleep. And there was even a play called The Hippopotamus put on at the Haymarket Theatre, which seems to have received rather mixed reviews. So people commented favourably on the makeup and the costume worn by the actor playing the hippo, but it seems that actually the play itself was faintly ridiculous and the plot was a bit of a travesty. As the years passed, Obaish's popularity gradually waned, and he was superseded by other zoological stars, including an elephant and its calf in 1851, and later on a giant anteater from Brazil. The hippo remained a bit of a favourite with visitors, though, and continued to be one of London Zoo's most popular attractions. So writing in 1877, the naturalist Frank Buckland remarked that perhaps no animal attracts more visitors at the gardens than hippo when he is inclined to be lively. There was, of course, a bit of a darker side to Obaish's story, which contemporaries largely suppressed or overlooked. So though he was largely presented as a triumph of British power and ingenuity, the hippo's capture was marked by violence. Several reports note that Obaish attempted to escape from his captors, and he had to be snared with a spear. And this left a deep scar on his body, which you can actually still see in Montezon's photo. And the hippo's seizure also followed the death of his mother, who would have been slaughtered to facilitate access to him, which was again pretty much common practice at the time. Once he was at the zoo, Obaish likely suffered from nutritional deficiencies and cramped living conditions. And according to several observers, he grew increasingly bad-tempered and morose as he got older. The naturalist John George Wood, who visited him in 1855, observed that the creature appears now to have a great objection to his visitors, and more than once opened his tremendous mouth and tried to bite them through the iron bars that bound his bath. In these attacks, the hippopotamus had no mercy on his own nose and enormous chin, which he knocked ruthlessly against the iron bars and stonework. So though well cared for by the standards of the era, Obeisch thus resented his captivity, suffering both physically and psychologically at the zoo. Obeisch died in 1878 of old age, although hippos can live significantly longer than he did in captivity. And he actually received an obituary in the Times. He was survived by his mate, Adela, a female hippo also brought from Egypt, and by his only surviving offspring, a little female hippo called, slightly obscurely, Guy Fawkes. She was actually born on the 5th of November 1872, which explains the name. It was quite difficult to sex a hippopotamus. A symbol of imperial potency, zoological novelty, and Victorian consumerism, Obeisch remains one of the most iconic animals ever exhibited in Britain. So, having given you a brief insight into the lives and deaths of Tuni and Obeisch, I'd like to conclude with a few reflections on the nature of celebrity in the animal world. Which species of animal were most often accorded star status at the zoo? And how did this manifest itself? And why is it that some animals were celebrated and remembered long after they died, whilst others were consigned to obscurity? And what does this say more broadly about the ways in which we continue to classify, perceive, and treat other animals? In an article published in the Times in 1938, following the arrival of the first living pandas at London Zoo, one journalist noted that the animals possessed 3 key qualities that made them, in his view, ideal zoo animals, namely that they were diurnal, striking, and rare. Though the journalist was only referring to pandas, these characteristics provide a good starting point for understanding why some exotic animals enjoyed a level of celebrity that others did not, and they could apply equally well to Tuni and Obeisch. So let's unpack them a little bit, taking them in reverse order. So firstly, rarity was key to ensuring an animal's celebrity status. Being the first of any species to go on exhibition in a particular country conferred a degree of fame on an individual, as did being the largest or being the first animal born in captivity. So Obeisch was the first hippo exhibited in Europe since Roman times, and Jumbo was said to be the largest elephant in the world, and he was also one of the first African elephants to appear in a zoo. If an animal was particularly difficult to capture and transport, this added to its fame and was often emphasised in guidebooks and advertisements. So the first anteater to reach Europe alive in Spain in 1776 required a special diet consisting of little pieces of bread, minced meat, and flour dissolved in water. Obeisch required his bespoke bathtub to prevent his skin from drying out during the voyage. And some of the first gorillas at London Zoo, Mock and Moyna, in the 1930s, were built a special ape house to prevent them from succumbing to disease with special ventilation. So essentially, the harder it was to procure an animal, the greater its level of fame post-arrival. It wasn't enough just to be rare, though. To achieve fame, animals also had to be striking, and it mattered how they looked. So mammals, for example, typically engendered more excitement than fish or reptiles, no matter how rare the latter were. And even within the category of mammals, some were clearly more equal than others. And this is encapsulated in this quotation by a journalist who visited the zoo in 1911. And he commented that among the mammals at London Zoo, excluding well-known beasts such as monkeys, giraffes, and elephants, and the large carnivora, the kangaroos, swine, and small rodents such as the koipu attract eager attention. Deer are little notice. Antelopes are passed by with the formal remark that they are pretty, and strange creatures like the Tasmanian wolf, the wombat, and the red panda awaken hardly any response in the public mind. It's worth noting that being striking didn't necessarily mean conforming to human standards of beauty. Obeisch certainly didn't, but it did mean having certain eye-catching features that were easily recognisable to the general public, like the long neck of the giraffe, the elongated tongue of the anteater, or the distinctive eye patches of the panda. And among the species that most often met these criteria were big herbivores, so things like elephants, hippos and rhinos, great apes, and from the 20th century pandas. And most of these animals were also named, which is testimony to their wider popularity. Finally, the last feature that's important to attaining celebrity is being diurnal, and this means being awake during the day. Though seemingly quite a small point, this was crucial in shaping the reception of exotic animals, because diurnal species were more likely to be active and interesting to visitors than nocturnal ones. Anteaters, for example, operate largely at night, and this led some visitors at London Zoo in the 1850s to describe the specimen there as slow and stupid, which is very unfair. More broadly, animals that performed or in some way interacted with visitors were most likely to achieve celebrity status, and exhibitions of liveliness and intelligence helped to increase interest in particular individuals. So to give a couple of examples, a sea elephant named Roland on the left there, who was exhibited in Berlin Zoo in the 1920s and 30s, was very popular with visitors. And this was because, according to one journalist, he was not only very large and very fat, but also, in the firm conviction of his admirers, very wise. Similarly, a chimpanzee named Sally at London Zoo in the 1880s learned to count up to 5 and to eat her meals with a spoon like a little lady, making her a firm favourite with visitors. Chunee, of course, was a diligent receiver of pennies and apples from visitors, as was Jumbo. So animals could enhance their level of fame through their own actions, whether by attacking a keeper and gaining notoriety, or conforming to anthropomorphic ideas about intelligence and civilization. Though it is worth remembering, of course, that the highly unnatural conditions in which many of these animals were forced to live compromised their natural behaviours and level of activities. And lastly, we should note that the duration of animal celebrity could be somewhat arbitrary, and that while a select few zoo animals achieved lasting fame, for the majority, their moment in the spotlight was fleeting. So Obeisch, for instance, as I mentioned, received an obituary in the Times when he died at 17 years after he arrived in Britain, but that was really unusual. By contrast, the giraffe that was sent to Paris by the Pasha of Egypt in 1827 and was very popular at the time, expired quietly 18 years later with no public fanfare, experiencing what the artist Eugène Delacroix described as a death as obscure as her entry into the world had been brilliant. What made the difference between ephemeral and enduring fame could be quite capricious. Chunee, for instance, was ultimately remembered more for his violent death than for anything he did in life. One thing that is certain, however, is that artistic representations and posthumous display via taxidermy played an important part in shaping the public memory of exotic beasts, something that the Miss Clara exhibition illustrates really well. Without the work of Pietro Longhi, Jean-Baptiste Udry, Joseph Wolfe and other artists, all of our celebrity pachyderms would probably have been forgotten. Thanks to their sketches, paintings, figurines and photographs though, Clara, Chunee and Obeisch remain in the public eye, inspiring books, documentaries and exhibitions long after the living beasts left this world. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Helen. There's so much there to unpack. I wrote down so many different notes there. I suppose not just that you're talking about actually quite harrowing and grisly details as you set up around the captivity of these animals, to how they were treated. There were some kind of light-hearted comments of the fact that they were given names, which really could be representative of just animals' nature of capturing those animals in the first place, what they were trying to do to them, that ownership over them. I wrote down the ideas of colonial expansion and where the animals originally came from and how they were almost expected not to react in their natural way. They were meant to react for the spectators seeing them. We have a map just as you open the exhibition, which actually shows where the animals represented in the artistic images in the Miss Clara exhibition came from originally, which I think just is a small way of showing how none of them came from Central Europe. It was all from really countries as part of that British Empire and that British power, as you said, that was represented, and Victorian consumerism. Yeah, really interesting there. And then just the relationship, which has been picked up in a couple of questions, which I'll go on to, of just the relationship, I suppose, between art and the natural sciences. So the fact that dissection and anatomy seems to have had this relationship with the visual arts for an incredibly long amount of time. If anyone came to the curator introduction in person that we had at the Barber a couple of weeks ago, we actually were talking around a painting by Joseph Stubbs, who used kind of dissection anatomy of horses to create such what were seen as beautiful and lifelike paintings at the time. So yeah, lots that I was thinking about there. I'm sure others were as well. There were a few kind of comments and questions. So just firstly, not connected to yours, Helen, but more a comment from Hilary, who was responding to the idea of looking at the time lapse and comparing the manual effort for what would be required to the original, and just around the pronunciation of how we're talking about, I say Miss Clara, but Robert, can you confirm?
Yeah, I suspect that the name was given by Darivat Mount van der Meer, and it certainly caught on in the German land, so I would suggest Clara would be correct. I guess we don't know, but we'll never know. But that's how I'd pronounce it, certainly.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I suppose, from working at the gallery and kind of how we talk about these art objects, and we do refer to the sculpture as Miss Clara in quite a warm-hearted, light-hearted way, of just, oh, there's Miss Clara there, actually thinking about this poor rhino who was kind of dragged around for spectatorship. And then just a nice question here for you, Helen, just commenting on what an interesting talk it was, so thank you. But do you think the work of Charles Darwin was also a factor in the popularity of these rare and exotic animals?
Oh, what a good question. I think to some extent, yes. Probably more in terms of primates and apes, because of obviously some of the arguments he was making about evolution. He was very interested in the orangutans that were exhibited at London Zoo and makes quite a lot of notes on them. So I think particularly when things like gorillas start to be exhibited, it's quite disturbingly actually the connections between them and humans are kind of flagged up. So I think that's very much a prominent thing for primates and creatures that were more related to humans, and people do make sort of snide comments about monkeys resembling humans, those sorts of things in the zoo. I think for these animals, probably it's more about imperial display and being able to get hold of animals at a distance. But when they're there, of course, scientists do study them. So I think some of whom agree with Charles Darwin and his ideas about evolution, some of whom definitely do not. So Richard Owen, who I mentioned, who studies Aubaiche, does not famously agree with Darwin's ideas about evolution. So these animals could be kind of pawns in these broader discussions. But I think, yes, these broader scientific debates certainly did influence a desire to have all these animals, to analyse them. But that could sometimes also be just a cover for wanting to show, imperial conquest and more of a sort of bold public display. But I think you can't always separate the two. It's a really good question, though.
Thanks, Helen. And a couple more questions, if you don't mind, before we move on to Samuel. So if by some lovely kind of coincidence here, there was a comment in the chat when another question came up. So David, thanks for your comment here of just questioning, might perhaps zoos and their membership be interested in this exhibition and the talk? And then we then had coincidentally a question coming in for the Q&A from Wessel here. So, hi Helen, I work at a zoo myself, and my zoo has made it a policy to not actively communicate names of animals towards the public. The aim of this is to have the public view the animals as representatives of their species instead of anthropomorphized individuals. And this has caused much debate amongst both staff and visitors. What do you think about this?
I think, again, absolutely fascinating to hear from someone that actually works at a zoo, and I'd be interested to hear what others think about this. Certainly in the past, again, not all animals were named, or at least it wasn't publicly communicated. It tended to be things like big herbivores, and also, I mean, you were mentioning the kind of colonial connotations, Flora. This is quite obvious. I mean, elephants often have names that are obviously at least meant to be Asian or African. Aubaiche is actually named after the island that he was taken from, so pretty obviously colonialist. Things like pandas almost always seem to have kind of Chinese style names, again, probably not accurate. but it's very much communicating that, which was obviously problematic and would be today. I guess I'd be interested to know whether, obviously, do keepers themselves at the zoo that this person works at, do they name animals but just not communicate it to the public? Because I suspect that happened a lot in the 19th century too, that even animals that weren't formally named or remembered were given some kind of a name, because that's sort of often the relationship people had. So I don't know. I can see the argument for not naming, and it definitely encourages anthropomorphism. It can lead to favoritism of certain animals over others, because obviously some species don't seem to inspire that. But I suppose it also could inspire a degree of affection and sympathy potentially. Again, I don't know. I'm on the fence with many of those things, actually. So I'd be interested to hear the views of others. But it's really interesting to hear the policy of that zoo and what they're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Wessel. I think a really valuable comment there. Really, thank you for putting that in the Q&A. I suppose interesting, Helen, it's making me think of when you brought the slide up of the panda and kind of seen as them the perfect captive animal, and they're quite cute and cuddly. And I remember when pandas being born, was it in Edinburgh Zoo, and all the kind of news coverage around that, because they're a certain type of animal that people are attracted to in that way, and they want to name the baby, and then how it differs from domestic pets and things. So so much to unpack there. And then just a kind of last point here of talking about zoos, and we've certainly had a lot of research into the difference between, say, menageries, the history of menageries, traveling menageries, and then zoos, which is seen as conservation today. But just when was the London Zoological Society founded? And does anyone know the answer to that?
The zoo itself opens in 1828. I think the society's founded a couple of years earlier than that, so sort of early 19th century. And it was founded just, explicitly to try and make a difference between menageries like the Exeter Change one and a more sort of scientific approach, following what had already happened in Paris after the revolution there. But personally, I'm skeptical about how far they achieved that, but that was the idea.
Thanks so much, Helen. And thank you for being so generous with the Q&A there. Please do keep your questions coming, and we will have more time at the end to have more Q&A. If Sam is ready now, I'm going to pass over to Samuel Shaw. Sam, do you mind if I introduce you slightly?
That's fine, that's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to pass over now to Dr. Samuel Shaw, who's a lecturer in art history at the Open University. And he teaches and researches on a wide variety of art, with a particular focus on the turn of the century art in Britain and the intersections between art and natural history. So the perfect subject for today. And before joining the Open University as a lecturer in July 2020, what a time to start a new job, Samuel. Samuel worked at the University of Leicester, having also taught at the Universities of Sussex, Warwick and York, and our very own University of Birmingham. I know a lot of our students have fond memories of you lecturing them. So pass over to you now, Samuel. Thanks so much for being here.
Wonderful, and you can all see the screen. Yes, fantastic. So thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this workshop. And I'm going to take this opportunity to sort of take a bit of a right turn and expand on something which I mentioned in passing in the catalogue essay that I wrote for this exhibition. And this is the issue of animal remains and their refashioning, and the way in which so-called celebrity beasts live on, or even perhaps rise to new levels of celebrity after their deaths. And for this reason, I should warn all those present, there will be images of animal remains in this presentation, nothing too grisly, but obviously, as Helen said earlier, some of this material is distressing, and I do want to foreground this. Okay. So there are many things I enjoyed about Barber's Miss Clara exhibition, and one of which, if you haven't been, you may have gathered this already, is the wide range of objects on display there. So this is an exhibition which, though very much centered on sculpture, nevertheless includes paintings, various types of print, posters, drawings, earthenware, gilt clocks, etc. So there's a rich variety of media on display here. However, one type of object that is absent but nevertheless relevant is some form of animal remains, of which the most obvious form is taxidermy. So here on the right of the screen, you can see a taxidermy rhinoceros from the Natural History Museum at Tring. And we probably all know what taxidermy is, but just as a reminder, taxidermy is the recreation of an animal using its skin, which is removed from the dead animal and then remounted onto a newly modeled structure. People sometimes refer to taxidermy as stuffed animals, but actually most modern taxidermy hasn't really been stuffed as such. It has a kind of wooden or metal or plaster frame underneath it. And this also may feature parts of the animal's original skeleton, but it doesn't always. So of course, there are many reasons why objects such as this one on the right were not included within this exhibition. There's a huge practical reason why there isn't a life-size rhinoceros in the Barber Institute, as you can imagine. It would not fit. Secondly, of course, taxidermy specimens are very fragile objects. They're hard to move, and in fact, in the case of rhinos, they're objects that are increasingly a security risk. So in fact, taxidermy rhinos, such as this very one at Tring, have attracted thieves due to the black market for rhino horn. And in fact, for this reason, most rhino horns that you see today in natural history museums are either heavily protected or fake resin replacements. So there's practical reasons why the Barber may have avoided taxidermy. The other reason, of course, is that taxidermy or animal remains, so bones is another example, are not traditionally exhibited in art galleries. So the Barber is an institute of fine art, not a natural history museum, and the presence of a dead animal might therefore raise questions. So this leads me to the question as to whether this object on the right might ever be described as fine art. Would it be fair or even ethical to present a sculptural representation of a rhinoceros like Miss Clara on the left alongside the remounted skin of an actual rhinoceros, or do they operate in completely different ways? So one of the main aims of my research at the moment is to try and kind of blur these lines between objects we find in natural history collections and objects that we find in fine art collections. The question, or the more general question of whether taxidermy is a form of art has often been asked. And of course, taxidermy has frequently appeared in art galleries in recent years, thanks to its popularity among contemporary artists, perhaps the most famous being Damien Hirst and Polly Morgan. In this sense, taxidermy has been subsumed within art, and it's often joked that taxidermy may be a more valuable skill for an artist starting out today than being able to draw. Contemporary use of taxidermy within the art world, however, is very different to historical taxidermy. So Hirst is using dead animals with the explicit intention of producing art for the market, whereas historical taxidermy was not made with art galleries in mind. In fact, my concern here is largely with 19th century taxidermy, which took many forms, which had in turn many functions, some leaning towards the clearly educational, others towards the evidently entertaining. And of course, this tension between education and entertainment is one that comes up a lot when talking about the history of exhibiting animals, both dead and alive. And Helen, in fact, just alluded to it in her presentation. So in a recent book on the art of taxidermy, the scholar Rachel Poliquin identified 8 distinct genres of taxidermy, which I've listed on this slide. And this is really just as a reminder that although we all possibly have a certain image in our mind when you hear the word taxidermy, it is in fact a very broad field. There are many kind of subgenres of taxidermy. And she identifies 8, there may be more, but these are perhaps the main 8. So hunting trophies, natural history specimens. So these are specimens that are representative of their species, as opposed to wonders of nature, which are specimens which are seen as unique. In the past, these might have been a goat with 3 horns, or Jumbo, it obviously is an elephant who was considered exceptional because he was especially large. Extinct species, preserved pets, fraudulent species. You may have seen these in some natural history museums. There's one in that fabulous museum in Brighton, in which people have taken parts of different animals and created something new and tried to pass that off as a completely different species. Anthropomorphic taxidermy. So Walter Potter is the best example of this in the 19th century. These are these very sort of weird displays in which animals are reanimated and then often dressed in human clothes. And then finally, animal parts used in fashion or decor. And all of these genres require different degrees of artistic license. So in the case of natural history specimens, within which there are several subgenres, the main aim of taxidermists is to reanimate the dead animal and to make it look as though it had never died. Within the boundaries of this task, however, there is plenty of scope for invention. So we see, for instance, on the top right, that Carl Akeley and his team at the Natural History Museum in New York took a very different approach to the team who worked on the elephant known as Sir Roger on the bottom right at the Kelvin Grove in Glasgow. So Sir Roger is reanimated to look something like a natural history illustration of a single elephant standing at rest, whereas the elephants at Akeley Hall are part of a larger tableau and are captured kind of mid-charge. So there's a real sense of movement in this display here. This is probably one of the most dramatic and impressive examples of taxidermy ever, to be honest. To give another example of this type of dramatic taxidermy, on the left you can see the lion and buffalo tableau at the Powell Cotton Museum in Kent, which actually takes the skins of 2 animals, a lion and a buffalo, and builds them into an imaginary scenario, albeit one inspired by actual events. And it's interesting to note that just as artists such as George Stubbs, mentioned by Flora a little bit earlier, whose painting of the lion attacking a horse we see on the right, just as he was inspired by close examination of dead animals, so he used to dissect animals himself, so too were taxidermists such as Rowland Ward and Company, the most famous taxidermists of the Victorian era, inspired by paintings by artists such as Stubbs. So we see here how the worlds of natural history and art history were exchanging ideas with one another and perhaps blurring the lines of their respective crafts. In light of this, I think it would be entirely fair to describe the object on the left as an example of 19th century sculptural practice. In other genres of taxidermy, such as anthropomorphic taxidermy and the use of animal parts, something rather different is obviously going on. So here, instead, the animal remains are being used as material for a completely different kind of object. So the example given here on the left is the example of the elephant footstool, which was a relatively common artifact in the 19th century. And sadly, these kinds of objects still do exist and are actually relatively freely available on the black market. On the right, we have the ivory billiard ball. This is another functional but essentially pointless item. So these particular objects are, of course, especially associated with pachyderms. So partly on account of their ivory, in the case of the billiard ball, but also in terms of the footstool on account of their size. So you could do things with an elephant foot that you couldn't do with the remains of other animals. So that's why elephant feet or rhinoceros feet often kind of got made into these objects. I should note that these objects are also very much, or could be seen as trophies of empire. So making objects from the remains of animals is a very human activity. It goes back obviously to the earliest days of human civilization. But mass producing curiosities such as these, I feel, goes beyond necessity and into the realms of a symbolic power play. So I want to turn now and think more specifically about the remains of celebrity beasts. Although my focus will be mostly on the 19th century, it's worth noting that the practice of making use of the remains of celebrity animals does go back much further. So actually, I do want to mention to start an elephant, Solomon, who is mentioned in Charles Avery's essay in the exhibition catalogue. Solomon is an elephant who travelled Europe in the 16th century and gained a similar celebrity to that of Clara. After Solomon's death in 1553, his body was taken apart and attempts were made to stuff or mount his skin. His bones were given as gifts to various people, and there was obviously a tradition at this time of not only giving exotic animals as kind of diplomatic gifts to members of royal families, but often in this, as in this case, the remains of exotic animals were given as gifts. And some of the bones of Solomon do remain in the form of this curious object here, which is another type of footstool. And you can see from the image on the right that it's not just been kind of made into this new sculpture object, but it's also been etched into, making it a really fascinating hybrid object. It's part decorative arts, part natural history. According to one source, the skin of Solomon also survived in some state into the 20th century, and parts of the hide were made into shoes, the whereabouts of which are unknown. As this exhibition explores, the celebrity of certain animals rarely ended with their deaths. They could continue to live through the objects depicting them, which we see in the exhibition, and through their reconstituted remains. So, for instance, this on the left is Queen Charlotte's famous zebra. This zebra was never named. I've worked on the history of zebras, and interestingly, they don't tend to be named, but some of them do gain a certain fame. And this one was, I suppose it had a kind of colloquial name, which was Queen Charlotte's ass. And obviously there's a kind of joke lying in that name. And this zebra was immortalized in George Stubbs's painting of 1763. And it was a very popular animal at the time it lived in London in the 1760s. When this zebra died about 10 years later in the 1770s, she was promptly stuffed or mounted and toured the country posthumously. As with Solomon, the elephant, however, taxidermy of this period was still relatively rudimentary, and the results were rarely impressive, and they were also rarely long-lasting, which makes it very likely that this painting is a much, much better record of the zebra than the taxidermy ever was. Indeed, the fact that the taxidermy zebra apparently ended up being displayed in a pub in York suggests it wasn't an especially impressive artifact. And I think, as far as we know, it does not survive to this day. And it's another good example of this, what Helen was talking about, of how sometimes celebrities would fall from grace. And I think that the zebra, there was a peak of celebrity when it was alive in the 1760s, and this continued for a few years after its death, but then it sort of slowly people got tired of it, although of course this painting does allow it to live on in some form. Something that really interests me about refashioned animal remains is that they offer the aura of authenticity, the kind of actuality of a deceased being, and yet they are also very unreal. Although sometimes described as specimens and exhibited in museums dedicated to the natural sciences, there is a certain amount of fakery or artistry involved. So on the bottom right here, you can see just here you can see a taxidermy quagga, which is in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and it purports to be the body of one of the last quaggas in captivity, an animal that therefore gained its celebrity from being both one of the last of its kind as well as the only one to be photographed. So this is the same animal above, and this is the animal photographed in London Zoo in the 1860s. I don't have time to go here into the complex history of quaggas, but do ask any questions about them if you wish to. What interests me, though, is that the Edinburgh quagga is indeed the remounted skin of the London quagga, but interestingly, the skeleton also exists, but in a completely different museum collection in North America. So this is the skull on the bottom right of the same animal in the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History in New Haven, Connecticut, where it's also presented as the body of the first quagga to be photographed. So this animal has a kind of afterlife on two continents, where it's, in both cases, it is a kind of authentic object, but of course it's split into two. And you can stand in front of this particular specimen in Edinburgh and you feel like you're having some kind of experience staring it into its, into its eyes. But of course, as with all taxidermy animals, you can't preserve eyes. So when we look into the eyes of a taxidermy animal, of course, we're actually looking into a glass eye, or perhaps in some modern cases, a plastic eye. So this kind of authentic experience that you feel you're having is not quite as authentic as perhaps you think it is. So pre-19th and indeed quite a lot of 19th century taxidermy has not lasted, but obviously specimens tend to fare better. So the elephant Hansken, who also features in the Barber exhibition, does still exist in skeletal form these days in Florence. His skin was also kept, but as far as I know, it did not survive. Two major 19th century elephants also survive in skeletal form. So Helen talked about Tuni. Tuni's skin, I presume, was ravaged by bullets. If it's true that it took over 150 to kill him, I doubt the skin was in a great state after his death and was therefore not fit to be remounted, and in fact was apparently sold to a tanner. However, as Helen said, his skeleton survived into the 1940s when it was the victim of bombing. The skeleton of the elephant Maharaja, who I mentioned in the catalogue essay and was a popular animal at Manchester Zoo, can still be seen in Manchester. And in fact, this is the skeleton in the museum. Apparently they recently exhibited it in the train station. And there's a kind of joke lying in that, because Maharaja's fame came from the fact that he refused to get on the train. So by exhibiting his skeleton in the train station, they were making a sort of a posthumous joke. I want to close, though, with this image of three celebrity beasts who do still exist in taxidermy form in major museums in this country. So on the far left, we have the aforementioned Sir Roger, an Asian elephant who died in 1900 in the Kelvin Grove in Glasgow. He died in the Scottish Zoo and then obviously was transferred to the Kelvin Grove. In the middle, we have Alfred the gorilla, who died in 1948, so a much more recent example. And he was a star of Bristol Zoo, and his body can now be found in Bristol museums. And on the right, Gerald the giraffe, who died around 1900 and who has been in the collection of the Royal Albert Memorial Museum since 1920 in Exeter. Now, these are all very popular exhibits, although in each case, the nature of their celebrity is somewhat complex. So Sir Roger was a menagerie elephant, part of Wombwell's touring menageries in the 1880s and 1890s. And in the last few years of his life, he was also a zoo animal. Like many of the elephants mentioned in the exhibition, he had both a tragic life and a tragic death. After many years in captivity, he was shot after becoming aggressive. Again, he had entered into must like Tuni before him, and it was seen wise at the time to put him down. His death was in fact apparently witnessed by a paying audience. So although there was great sadness at the fact that he died, somebody nonetheless took the opportunity to make a kind of rather grisly spectacle of it. The violence of his life and death, however, while frequently alluded to, is easy to forget when standing in front of his refashioned remains. Bullet wounds are sewn up, signs of aggression tempered, the elephant becomes a peculiar relic of itself, the remains of an individual that stand in for human fantasies of what an animal should be. Turning on to Alfred. Alfred the gorilla was also a zoo animal, probably more popular than Sir Roger ever was, although again, his posthumous celebrity has lasted longer than his living celebrity. So he died in 1948, but he's still a very popular exhibit today. Alfred, like Sir Roger, remains an attraction and is treated almost as if he was still alive. Although I should note that attempts have been made by the museum in recent decades to contextualize his body as part of a biological display and to move away from the idea that the body is simply kind of a spectacle. And this perhaps speaks back to that issue that we were talking about before my presentation of people working in zoos being advised not to share the names of animals with the public. There's the kind of anxiety in zoos and also in museums about making too much of a spectacle of these specimens and anthropomorphizing them so much that they're not taken seriously. My final example is an especially interesting one, as Gerald the giraffe is the only animal here, I think, that was named after his death. So this particular specimen did not suffer any kind of celebrity among humans during his lifetime, but has picked up celebrity status in the many years since. So Gerald, who we can see in the middle here, shares with Sir Roger a violent past. He was one of hundreds of African animals killed by the hunter Sir Charles Peel in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, his posthumous veneration tends to blind visitors to the dark imperial history that lies behind his existence. Although the museum is very alert to this and has displayed the giraffe quite differently in recent years, the fact that the museum sells cuddly giraffe toys in their shop fuels this kind of counter-narrative in which the refashioned body of a particular deceased individual is reanimated and recast as a cozy icon. So I'm not meaning here to kind of criticize the museum, but really point to some of the strange tensions that exist in the display of these animals. So you have Sir Gerald put in this room that explores kind of empire and hunting and the capturing of exotic animals. And it's quite a serious topic. And then you go into the museum shop and you can buy cuddly giraffes. And it's a very, very strange tension. I don't know quite what to make of it, but I think it's something we need to think about when we're in these spaces. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you all for your time, and I do welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Samuel. A brilliant note to end on there. I think just that word tension, it goes back to the very start of your presentation there, where you're talking about the exhibition kind of human and animal remains, and I suppose the ethics of that, which is such a big conversation and question just within the museum and gallery sector. So it's nice to link that, the idea of ethics and then tension, kind of rounding off your presentation. Interesting thoughts there on the idea of context as well. So you mentioned the example of taking the elephant skeleton out and putting it in the train station, like what happens when we take these objects out of, say, a museum or gallery environment and into other places, and what conversation happens because of that. It kind of made me think of examples where they're really considering the ethics of remains as well. So I went to the Wellcome collection recently, and I know that they've re-looked at the display of their whole collection in terms of these conversations and how audiences find these objects, or actually not, because they've taken a lot out in their gallery spaces. So some really interesting just thoughts that I had there. And then there were some nice comments in the chat, and just Hilary asking after Helen's presentation, recent attitudes. So, you know, how do we bring all of this into the present day? What do we think now as society, and actually have our views changed? Hilary spoke about the supposed death of imperialism, but what legacy actually has that had within our cultural institutions. We're talking a lot around decolonisation at the moment, and kind of museums looking and reviewing their collections in light of this. So what conversation is happening there? Please do put any questions through. We do have a kind of bit of time now, 5-10 minutes, if they do have any questions.
Can I just respond to that point you just
Yes.
mentioned? Yeah, because one of the slides I brought up was that image of the lion and the buffalo at the Powell Cotton Museum in Kent. And I don't know if anybody's been there, but it's an amazing and very uncomfortable museum. It's essentially a museum dedicated to a imperialist white hunter of the late 19th, early 20th century, and all of the animals that he shot in these kind of fantastic dioramas. So it's a very strange and uncomfortable museum, but they're very aware of that. And in the last few years, they've begun this project on decolonizing. And it's an absolutely fascinating project. And if anybody's ever in the vicinity of that museum, I do recommend going there just to see really a great case study of how a museum is dealing with very, very difficult objects and anxieties and trying to kind of make them available to new publics and put them in new contexts. So yeah, I do recommend that.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And there was just a question from Wessel on your very first slide, just about the rhino that was pictured there on the right-hand side next to Miss Clara. Just the type of rhino. Do you know what type of rhino that is? There was a question here of, is it a Sumantran rhino, which is extremely rare? So do you know the answer to that, Samuel?
I think it is, but it might not be. I did realize midway through the presentation, I suddenly thought I need to be more accurate about which types of animals are being presented here, particularly in the case of pachyderms, because of course they're often split between two continents. So some are from Africa and some are from Asia. So I tried to go back through and add which species they were, but I think I missed that one out. So I can't say for sure what species that is.
Yeah, but then an interesting, I suppose, about how taxidermy, some could see it as a learning and education tool because there needs to be a legacy of that animal. But then say if that animal is extinct, there needs to be a legacy because of human intervention. So that's a really interesting relationship. There's a question in the chat here. It might be for Robert, I suppose. Is it known what happened to Clara's remains on her death? I understand she was rumoured to have died outside a pub in London. Is it known if she was ever exhibited posthumously? So I suppose linking to Sam's presentation there.
Yeah, that's correct to say that she died, well, she was last exhibited anyway at a pub in London in 1758. Apparently, I was told yesterday, in fact, that she died from an excess of eating oak leaves, which sounds like a very English complaint. But I don't actually know what happened. I don't know if it is recorded or if anything did happen to her bodily remains. I mean, I would imagine there was some attempt to salvage them and make money from them, but nothing's more known. It's a rather quiet end to a very, lively and well-recorded life, that she should die so sort of quietly and unlamented. Maybe they'd moved on to other things. Could I just, when I've got the air, just mention another sort of case study of the afterlife of a celebrity beast, and that's Jumbo. I'm sure Sam knows and Helen know this story, but I'm just looking at the Tufts University website in America, because Tufts was the beneficiary, if that's the word, of the donation of Jumbo's stuffed hides, they put it, through P.T. Barnum, who was an early trustee and benefactor of the university. And just reading from their website, it says, I quote, "For 86 years, Jumbo stood in Barnum Hall and was a veritable mecca on campus. Students, parents, and other campus visitors would pop pennies in his trunk or give a tug on his tail to bring luck for an upcoming exam or athletic competition. Unfortunately, Jumbo mania came to a fiery end on April the 14th, 1975, when Barnum Hall and the beloved elephant were consumed in an electrical fire. So a double sad ending for Jumbo, but Jumbo's spirit lives on. Some of his ashes were recovered in a peanut butter jar, no less, that has remained in the athletic director's office, where students continue to rub it for good luck." So there you go.
Thank you, Robert.
Particularly strange one.
And actually, if you go to their website, there's a sort of video presentation all about Jumbo. So worth following up.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone today, Robert, Helen and Samuel, for putting together such thought-provoking presentations, not just, I suppose, using the Miss Clara exhibition itself, but using it as a catalyst for all of these satellite conversations that we have. So a big thank you to our audience as well, because this event wouldn't be happening unless we had, I'd say, people here, but it feels like we've been talking to ourselves because it's a webinar. I will be launching just a little bit of a feedback poll now. I appreciate if you had a couple of minutes just to kind of give us any feedback, or do put comments in the chat. Really, your thoughts and feedback are really welcomed. But just a big thank you to our speakers. I think everyone would agree it's been a really thought-provoking afternoon. The exhibition is on until the 27th of February. So if you are in the UK, which I know are not actually all of you are, which has been really interesting, please do visit. I'll pop a link in now about information on how to visit us, and you can of course be in touch with us if you have any further questions. So thank you everyone. Any lasting comments from the panel?
Just to thank everyone, join everyone in thanking everyone for attending, and of course particularly Helen and Sam for giving such wonderful presentations. It's been really enjoyable to hear a bit more.
And I'd just like to thank Robert for inviting us and Flora for organising this, and everybody for attending. It's been great, albeit at a distance and I can't see you, but thank you for the stimulating questions.
Yeah, thanks everyone. If you get a chance to go to the exhibition, if you haven't already been, then please do go, because it's really great.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. I'll stop the recording now. I do have to hang on screen because we have the poll kind of going live, but please feel free, panelists, to leave as and when. And thanks so much.